Great. So I think we have quite a few who have joined us already. So just big welcome, everyone. And thank you so much for joining us today on the International Women's Day for the webinar, Unlocking Potential of Women Entrepreneurs, Provision of Gender Inclusive Business Development and Financial Services. My name is Sarah Anderson, and I'm a technical officer and coordinator of the ILO Rebuilding Better project, which is supporting women entrepreneurs who are impacted by COVID-19 in Malaysia, Philippines, and Thailand in partnership with JP Morgan. And in today's webinar, which is organized by the Rebuilding Better project together with the ILO's Women's Entrepreneurship Development Program, we will be discussing the key role of service providers in building a more enabling and inclusive environment for entrepreneurs or for strengthening entrepreneurial ecosystems. We had one of the participants who signed up today raise the important topic of gender equity in the registration form, and the concept of equity as in fairness of treatment for men and women according to their respective needs, the recognition that women and men have different needs and that these differences should be identified and addressed in a manner that rectifies any imbalances is a good starting point, we think, for this webinar, because this is really what ensuring gender inclusive services is all about. The ILO, we have been active in this area of building capacity of service providers to become more gender inclusive for many years. And most recently, we have published a very practical guide on this topic, which we are officially launching and which you will learn more about shortly. Before we get started, also just a few technical inputs. If you would like to ask a question or contribute with a perspective or an idea during the webinar, which is something that we very much encourage you to do, then please use the Q&A in the chat function, which is enabled throughout the webinar. And please also note that this webinar will be recorded and it will be uploaded on the ILO website afterwards. Good. Well, without further ado, I will pass the floor to Virginia Rose Lozada, who is a technical specialist and the global coordinator of the ILO's Women's Entrepreneurship Development Program, who will be setting the stage for us in her opening remarks. Virginia, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sarah. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. And as I'm here, I'm reading the chat. Happy International Women's Day. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. Sarah, you've done a wonderful job of actually cutting my intervention by a few minutes because you've said it basically all, and that's great. So basically, yes, I'm the coordinator of the ILO's Women's Entrepreneurship Development Program. And today it's a moment of celebration for all of us. And I think what better way than to kind of launch this guide that we've been working on for a few months in partnership between the ILO Women's Entrepreneurship Development Program, the Rebuilding Better project funded by JP Morgan, and with a great collaboration with Value for Women in getting to this very practical guide. Now, just before I give the floor to really the speakers who are really the interesting part here, I just wanted to say, as Sarah was saying, you know, the ILO has been working and supporting women's entrepreneurship development for decades, and there has been a standing program for over 15 years. And it is in the governing body that we were given the mandate to work primarily on 3 levels. First, it's at the macro level, and it's really trying to identify those barriers and those bottlenecks that are impeding women's entrepreneurship development from flourishing. And the idea is to, you know, help partners on the ground to come up with actionable recommendations and advocacy to make programs and the ecosystem more enabling for women's entrepreneurship development. And then we also work at the Meso, and this is really the core of what we're going to be talking about today. And we're going to be sharing a little bit some of the approaches, some of the tools that from the ILO we've been promoting to support our service providers and our constituents in supporting women entrepreneurs. And that's really looking at service providers and giving them the tools and the thinking process to see how they can better service the women entrepreneurs. I believe on the chat, we will be sending shortly a little video on some of the tools that we use. For example, we help service providers reflect in how they can improve their outreach, their products and services, but even their own ways of operating in order to be able to better support women entrepreneurs. Now, that is through the WeCheck, and you'll be hearing a little bit more about that. And there's a fantastic opportunity coming now that Sarah will be presenting at the end. And then there's also this guide, right? We really wanted to give something very practical, because often we have service providers saying, you know, we're open, you know, everyone is welcome. What do we mean by gender equality? How are we supposed to do it? And so we wanted to make something that was very, very practical. And this will be hearing about it right after by Jen, who'll do a terrific job in highlighting and walking us through that guide. And then last but not least, we also support and work on developing training programs and tools to help women entrepreneurs. And that can go from very basic business management to financial education, to formalization. And that can be from both a global standard kind of training programs to very specific needs linked to specific projects. So it's absolutely wonderful to be here. I'm really, really excited. Just to let you know that the guide currently is in English, but it will soon be available in French and in Spanish. Without further ado, Sarah, I give you back the floor. And again, happy International Women's Day.
Thank you so much for that, Virginia, and also thank you for giving us that more elaborate overview of the ILO WED program. Next, I will hand over to Jen Green, who is a business and gender expert with the woman-led global social enterprise Value for Women. Apologies. Jen was the lead author from Value for Women in this collaboration to develop our new guide on gender inclusive service provision. And she is, as Virginia said, she's here today to share a bit more about this content. So Jen, thank you so much again for joining, and over to you.
Thank you, Sarah and Virginia, and thanks everyone for joining today. Yes, so the objective, of course, of today's session is, to explore kind of the tools that we've developed in this guide and to understand a bit more about, what you can get from this and how to use it. So I first kind of want to take the opportunity to thank the ILO for developing this guide with us. Value for Women has been a service provider and advisor in the field of gender equality and women's economic empowerment for 10 years. And so it's been great to distill some of our learnings from that time and working with a variety of ecosystem actors to create some really practical guidance and tools here that we hope will help everyone to create more inclusive financial services and business development services. So we're going to kick off with a question, and please kind of use the raise hand function if you agree with this statement. When offering business support services to companies, we don't need to do anything differently for men and women. Do you agree with that statement? Raise your hand. Great. Wow. Excellent. So very few people are raising their hands. I think you're correct. If your conclusion is that actually, women-led businesses and women entrepreneurs have different needs than men because of the unique challenges that they are presented with because of society, culture, and other barriers because of their gender. So essentially, what we're doing here is talking about what, in particular, our research and practice has indicated that women need that's different from kind of general offerings, which are what we would call default men offerings. So we know that gender neutral is not enough, and that providing a one-size-fits-all solution actually results in unequal outcomes that don't meet everyone's needs. Sarah mentioned at the start of this program, the idea of equity and the idea that we need to be sensitive to the unique kind of characteristics of each person and respond accordingly. And actually, ideally, eventually we go beyond kind of making up for the barriers that each person faces, and we remove the barriers altogether. But until that time comes that we can remove those barriers, I think the best and most effective and most just approach is to respond to each person's needs individually. So what we know is that bias is definitely something that women, especially women in business, still face. This is a really interesting survey from Pew Research that asked, when jobs are scarce, should men have more right to a job than a woman? And you see that, yeah, there's kind of a variety of responses kind of across different geographic regions. But, you know, in many parts of the world and in many of our economies, it is presumed that if jobs are scarce, men should be the ones working and women should be the ones at home taking care of domestic labor. And yeah, we know that women in Asia Pacific spend 4.1 times more time on unpaid care work than men, and that's much higher than the global average of 2.5. And that's from a 2019 report from IFC. We also know that only 9% of venture capital and private equity funding in East Asia goes to women-led firms. We know that there's a huge finance gap, something like 2.3 trillion for women-led MSMEs. So yeah, all of these results suggest that bias is both knowingly and unknowingly shaping hiring and investment practices. And it's something that we need to recognize and to actively counteract. So what can we do? We can adjust. We can respond in a way that, yeah, seeks to bring women the same opportunities and the same access that men-led firms have. So there's a huge business opportunity here. Because women are underserved, actually, they are very good potential clients. And, you know, by serving women-led businesses better, you know, we have the opportunity to impact all of the jobs that these women-led businesses could make, all of the service providers that they could hire, as well as their own families. So, you know, there's a great opportunity here to impact overall GDP, as well as, you know, these specific businesses. I won't spend too much time on the numbers because I think most of you are probably very familiar with these. But yeah, the truth is that where women are given more opportunities, economies grow. Yeah, there's more educational achievement. There's better job quality, better nutrition for children, better health outcomes. And, you know, those gender gaps still are very prominent. So we have quite a ways to go. So what are the limitations in our kind of approach so far to gender inclusion? Well, one, we wrote this guide because we recognized that there was kind of a need for a starting point, some entry-level steps that required fewer resources. We wanted to make sure that there was something practical that everyone could implement immediately. Instead of, you know, something that might take some time to work up to. And so that's really what this guide is focused on, low resource intensive steps. This guide is also intending to create a preparation for organizations that will set you up for future inclusion work and programs. So this is really just the beginning, or, you know, kind of the introduction to becoming a more gender inclusive organization. And so, yeah, we hope that this guide kind of, yeah, creates that entry point and is an on-ramp for future work. We also wrote this guide, yeah, to build inclusive processes that help to highlight other gender gaps and opportunities for improvement. So yes, we know, yeah, that innovation kind of drives diversity and that economic value. This is all a virtuous circle. So supporting women entrepreneurs helps attract and retain new talent. This enables market innovation and growth, which leads to brand loyalty, as a lot of our customers are women. Women control 70 to 80% of household consumption finance. And then, yeah, this kind of leads to then future opportunities. So this graphic is from our ecosystem landscaping to advance a transparent implementation of women's empowerment principles. But really, yeah, what it shows is, you know, how all of these things are interconnected. The ecosystem for supporting private sector development, you know, needs to encompass women at every level. And also, yeah, as the next slide shows, it's actually kind of a mutually beneficial circle of gender inclusive services from different types of stakeholders. So everyone has a role to play in breaking the bias. Breaking the bias is, of course, this year's International Women's Day theme. And yeah, everyone from government to NGOs, market services, all of different kinds of providers, and financial institutions all have a role to play in creating a more inclusive system. But what we're focused on today, of course, is service providers, both financial and business development services. And how do we ground our approach to inclusion? Well, we start with data and we add empathy. So data says, what are we already doing? And so data needs to be collected. It needs to kind of show you who your target clients are, who is actually walking in the door, what services are they using, and where are their disproportionate impacts that seem to follow gender. That's identifying gender gaps. Empathy says, who is not in the room? Who is having challenges in accessing your services? Who is having challenges in kind of leveraging these services to be successful? And so, yeah, what we're doing is actually trying to avoid stereotypes and bias by going to the data first. And so data is an important part of this whole process, and collecting sex disaggregated or gender disaggregated data is the single one thing that, if you can't do anything else, will really make a difference in terms of being able to pinpoint where women are not being served by your organization. So let's kind of back up and talk about the guide itself. So this guide, is based on our role as practitioners and advisors. It seeks to encourage organizations to take their first steps on the journey to gender inclusion, and it uses checklists and prompts to help you start right now. So you can open this guide and find tools that you could use immediately. Of course, this guide is short. It's meant to kind of have an action bias. And there's a lot of things that we couldn't kind of include in this. So, this is not about mindset change or behavioral change and empathy exercises. This is not, of course, an exhaustive examination of these topics. And these strategies are not going to fix everything. But what they are going to do is, kind of give you some initial tools and strategies to start to see, where your organization can make movements to be more gender inclusive. So let's talk about, what some of those tools look like. What we've done is we've, created a narrative that explains kind of how to go about assessing where your organization currently is, given what data you may collect at the moment, or whatever is available to you. We've also included, especially both short and extended versions of checklists, which will help you for different types of products and points in your, kind of service provision journey to figure out, where you can be more gender inclusive. This is an example from our design portion. So the design of products and services can be made more gender inclusive by including women in design. Women know how other women might use your products or services, and they will have the best kind of perspective on where the design of these products and services may unintentionally be difficult for women to use or maybe excluding women. For sure, there are lots of ways to do that. You can have, focus groups. We, of course, suggest hiring women into every team in your organization so that women are part of every decision. We think that having more diverse decision-making teams, of course, just increases our collective intelligence and is proven with research to make better decisions. So design is an important aspect. Planning is our next slide. In planning how to deliver services and products, you can also, consider participants' time and mobility constraints. You can identify constraints faced by mothers, fathers, and those responsible for the care of family members, because certainly, there are certainly like a lot of challenges presented by childcare, but a lot of us may have care for, people who are not children, who might be adults, they might be elderly, or, have other disabilities and things like that. And so we want to make sure to be thinking of all of these types of constraints. So planning. And then our next kind of short checklist here is on facilitation and how using gender inclusive language, And this includes kind of communication in an audio-visual way, making sure that, you know, things like pictures and videos use women in positions of power and not in kind of stereotypical environments. Encourage the development of self-confidence and leadership skills for both men and women. And then, yeah, of course, you know, incorporate feedback from women to ensure that there is an ongoing process of continued learning and improvement. So I'll just quickly wrap up here with a list of some of the other resources in the guide. I encourage you just to download the guide and check these out. We have a checklist on gender inclusive communications. There are sex disaggregated metrics and indicators. If you aren't sure what type of data to start collecting, this is a checklist that could be very helpful. Checklists about gender inclusive design and delivery, of course. Checklists for about gender inclusive workplace practices, because of course, if our workplaces don't reflect diversity, then it's very difficult to convince our clients that that's a priority for us. And that includes both recruitment and workplace culture and retention. And then of course, impact measurement, if you want to see how you're doing and to measure that. We also have a checklist about how to design a gender inclusive impact measurement. So final slide is key takeaways. First of all, please collect data that has gender included so that you can identify gaps. Secondly, not about us without us. Include in your decision-making processes everyone who has been traditionally left out of your products and services. Thirdly, think about the challenges of your audience before you speak or act. Fourth, approach problems with curiosity instead of assumptions. And lastly, remember that gender inclusion is a process, not a destination. And we're always learning and trying new strategies to figure out how to overcome the barriers that different groups are facing. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for letting us present this tool to you today. And I hope that, that it's helpful and useful and that it's something that you all can take into your organizations.
Thank you so much, Jen, for that presentation and also for this great partnership in developing this guide. I think we've really enjoyed working with Value for Women on this. And for those of you who are here and who are active and working in this area, for the Rebuilding Better project, I would just want to share that this is really already a great resource for us. It's something that we are sharing with partners and organizations that we're working with. We also started to adapt the content and are now also delivering workshops to partners on how to make their services more gender inclusive. So most recently, we worked with the Department of Trade and Industry in the Philippines to train their business advisors employed with the SME centers that are located across the country to build more awareness of how to become more gender inclusive. So it's very practical, it's very useful. So just some food for thought for all of you to think about how to use it in the future. Great, so it's time for us to move towards the panel discussion. And so I would like to introduce our three additional panelists that we have with us today. First, let me introduce my dear colleague, Sudha Gurti, who also sits here in the UN premises in Bangkok and who's the manager of the UNSCAP Catalyzing Women Entrepreneurship Program. Secondly, I would like to introduce Jeannie Javalusa, who is a multi-awarded social entrepreneur, the co-founder of Great Women, of EcoStore and the Eon Group, as well as the private sector representative for gender in the MSME Development Council of the Department of Trade and Industry in the Philippines. And then lastly, welcome also to Katerina Meloni, who is the founder and the managing partner of Connecting Founders, which is an excellent Bangkok-based financial advisory firm who's supporting women-led businesses in Southeast Asia in their fundraising and scaling up journey. So thank you so much for joining us today, all of you. We have several questions lined up for this discussion, and what we're aiming to do here is to target different levels in the entrepreneurial ecosystem to try to pinpoint what can be done to ensure more equal access to services. And we will be focusing a lot initially on the meso level, which Virginia was also referring to earlier, but then moving ultimately to a bit more of a macro perspective before we proceed with questions from the audience. I would like to direct the first question to you, Katrina. You have a very thorough understanding of the Southeast Asia context. You know the type of services that are oftentimes available to entrepreneurs here, who are the service providers. And so what we want to ask you is, what are some of the key challenges or barriers that you have seen for service providers in providing more gender inclusive services?
Thank you, Sarah, for the question. I think we're diving right into challenges. So I'm happy to share the experience of connecting founders. So for us, so I'll be focusing on service providers of non-financial services. We are an intermediary. And while it's not the only thing that we do, a lot of the businesses, when they first come to us, they want help in terms of their capital raise. So I'm gonna focus on that. So for us, one of the key challenges that we've had to consider over the years in dealing with women-owned businesses is really this concept of the commercial viability of doing that. So when at parity of keeping everything the same, raising capital for women-owned businesses is much harder than for men-owned businesses. It's got nothing to do with the attractiveness of the opportunity. The reliability is simply based on biases, which is apropos considering the theme of today, right? It's really the biases in the finance world, in the investment world, that basically consider women more risky. And so it really questioned these women's ability to execute on the vision that they're set to do. So for example, when you're in meeting with investors, female founders are twice more likely to get the so-called prevention questions, which are basically related to risks and challenges related to their opportunity. And male entrepreneurs tend to get questions related, the so-called promotion question, related to the size of the opportunity, the potential, the upside. So as you can imagine, this whole conversation with female founders tends to gravitate on risks on the downside. So investors oftentimes, they come out of the meeting thinking that it's female founders are trying to play it safe, they're trying to keep it small, and so they often walk away. Now, what does that mean for intermediaries such as us and for other intermediaries looking to raise capital? Now, that means that basically working with female founders, women-owned businesses, is raising is much harder. It takes much more time, it takes much more effort, and there is no guarantee that even if you put the same time, that necessary time and effort, that the raise is going to be successful. It becomes very costly. And so if you are a commercial operator, then by logic, you would have to sort of pass on these additional costs to your clients, which are the small and medium-sized businesses. Now, of course, it's quite difficult to do that in practice because small businesses have very limited financial resources. And so it's pragmatic. I mean, in practice, it's very difficult to do that. So what happens is that sometimes some intermediaries, either they turn away from women-owned entrepreneurs or they relegate them to like a very small percentage of their portfolio, right? And so maybe it's a 80-20 type of situation. Now, for us, what we've managed to do over the years, after spending a lot of time thinking about this challenge of commercial viability, is that we decided to stay true to the mission of focusing on female founders and women-owned businesses. But then also we decided to focus on depth rather than breadth. So we focus on a smaller number of select female founders, women-owned businesses with whom we had a more established relationship, and that they were also more truly, to be honest, so they were also more established in their own markets, and so they had also more likelihood to raise capital because of the established track record. So I wanted to put this challenge out there. I think perhaps there are other in the audience that they might have experienced, or perhaps they might find it useful if they support own programs, focusing on raising for female founders.
Katrina, and I think you're raising a very important point in terms of perceptions and what that is not only costing for women entrepreneurs themselves that are trying to raise funds, but also for those intermediaries as yourself who is trying to support them. And how that is ultimately influencing your commercial viability. So thanks so much for bringing that very important perspective. I want to move to Jen and to Virginia and asking a similar question to you, but slightly redirected. You're both working at the global level, and so we wanted to ask you also if there's any characteristics, skills, or competencies that service providers display that you see are providing gender inclusive services, and what is there that we can learn from them and bring up in this conversation. Jen, do you want to go first?
Sure, yes, thanks. Yes, so when I was thinking about this question, I think there are 3 practices and 3 characteristics or skills that are really instructive. The first one is commitment. I think senior leadership in organizations really need to both talk the talk and put the money where their mouth is. As Katarina said, there's huge challenges to service providers who are trying to close these gender gaps. And there needs to be commitment from the top levels in all stakeholders, government, NGOs, service providers, private sector, to prioritize these issues if we're going to get anywhere. Second practice that I think is really helpful is including women as service providers themselves, whether that's, hiring women to be the front lines when, as loan officers and as business services advisors. Women really understand and relate to the problems that women entrepreneurs have much better. Women may feel more comfortable as entrepreneurs approaching other women and explaining their problems. That's a huge one that I think makes a big difference. Thirdly, and I've said this before, is really the data collection and making sure that you're able to identify where these gender gaps are by collecting sex disaggregated data. I'll let Virginia answer a bit first.
No, thank you, Jen. Actually, it's incredible. We pretty much have the same 3 points, just in different orders, basically. Kind of looking at the organizations that have gone through, for example, a WeCheck process with us, I'd say absolutely, it's a mindset, it's the commitment from top management in these issues. And then I was going to say, the M&E, that they have this adaptive management. I think where we've had the most success, it's when it's come into those moments of reflection by the organization of, we need to change, we don't know how, and we need the data and we need the information. And that has been, the ones that have really strived have been the ones who have said, data, it's where it is. And I loved how Jen said, that the data and the empathy, right? That combination to me is extremely, extremely powerful. And then again, a slightly different, but in the same line, I was saying diversity in their workforce, where you do have women, and especially women in top management or in those middle sections, that can really help to kind of shake a bit the tree, right? And make some of these changes. So for me, again, I completely agree with Jen's 3 points about commitment, data, and diversity in the workforce.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Virginia, for that, and also for Jen for those similar but great inputs from all of you. I think one addition that I think has also
Oops. Did we lose Sarah there?
I think we lost Sarah.
I believe we did lose Sarah.
Just when we were getting to the good part.
So who'll pick it up? Jen?
Okay, I see she's back.
Sure. No,
You disappeared.
My apologies. It was great that my connection decided to disappear just now. But what I was saying was thank you so much, Virginia and Jen, for those initial inputs. And I just also wanted to share a perspective from the Rebuilding Better project, where I think where we have seen also that organizations that are in early stages of taking leaps towards more gender inclusive services, also recognizing other stakeholders in the ecosystem, such as women entrepreneurship associations, for example, and letting them also come in and share their understanding of women's needs. I think that is also an important part of this building perspective and awareness of this particular issue. So my again apologies for that little internet hiccup. I think we're going to move on, and we have identified then several characteristics when it comes to how organizations are that are well on their journey towards becoming more gender responsive. We've seen what are some of the common characteristics there. We've also heard from Katerina on some constraining factors that may hinder service providers. So what we're going to do now is take a step back and then try to identify what can be done in order to support service providers in better responding to the needs of women. And so I wanted to first direct the question to Sudha and Jeannie to also let you come in here and then ask you, so what do you think are some measures that needs to be taken by governments, by other stakeholders to support service providers in becoming more gender inclusive in their service provision? Sudha, you want to go first?
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Sarah, and everyone. It's really been such an inspiring last half an hour. I think we will be taking a lot of this back to our work when we go back to the countries. So just as a quick introduction, I'm working on this project called Catalyzing Women's Entrepreneurship, which really looks at building a better ecosystem in the region, right? So a lot of it is to do with service access and service use. And of course, like we've heard from all the previous speakers, there are different kinds of services and different kinds of service providers. Maybe I'd like to focus my intervention on our work we're doing with governments as service providers, and what were some of the challenges and how did we get around to it, and what are the challenges that continue, right, when we do this. So to start with, I think, like also Jen mentioned, we need evidence, right? I mean, we need hard evidence on what the issues are. But once we have the evidence, how do we also make sure that government as a service provider is acting on that information? I'll take one example from the project countries that we work with in Vietnam, basically. And when we started the project a few years ago, we see that while as soon as we speak about gender programs, we are always directed to the women's ministries, right? As almost like a immediate need to do so. But also a number of policies and services do fall under the mandate of the SME ministries. So we decided that through this project, we would only be working primarily with SME ministries and then bring in the other players in the ecosystem who play an important role. So for example, we started approaching the Ministry of Planning and Investment, which is the key SME ministry there. And we were very pleasantly surprised on how receptive they were to the findings of the research. Also because I think there was very quick realization that this is a win-win strategy. So we looked at three important areas of work that we wanted to work with them on. From the research that we did, it showed that yes, there are gaps in accessing financial related services. There's huge gaps, especially during the COVID, on information on how to access the different support schemes that the government is making available. There's of course additional care burden that women entrepreneurs were having, and there was a lot of psychosocial stress on women led businesses and women in general during this time. So we decided to approach it through three different activities, and that has of course snowballed into many more. The first is we looked at, when we are looking at policies and services that are required for women entrepreneurs, let's map out the key agencies and institutions and groups that are important. So from the State Bank of Vietnam to the Women's Ministry to the economic ministries, and women entrepreneur associations. These were some of the key ones. I'm leaving out a few. This is not an exhaustive list, but we established what we call a coordination committee at the national level. And the Ministry of Planning and Investment is leading this committee. This committee takes regular stock of what are the issues, what are the service gaps, and what can be done through existing policies and initiatives, and what new has to be done. And it initially started as a project initiative, but now it's gone much beyond, and it's become a national committee that looks at women's entrepreneurship. So I think it's important that we invest in these institutional mechanisms and go beyond the traditional agencies, while not, and we're in no way undermining the work that the gender ministries does. But I think it's an issue, like we've all heard, has to cut across, and several agencies have to take the lead. So investing in institutional coordination. Then the second activity we looked at is what are some of the key policy instruments that fall under the mandate of the Ministry of Planning and Investment. And this was basically the SME law in the country. That's the principal guiding document. So we saw that there are several provisions that relate to women-led businesses, but with our consultation with women entrepreneurs, we found that the implementation was almost nil. So we did a very thorough assessment together with the ministry to assess the implementation effectiveness of the law. And a number of recommendations came out, which have now been included into a new decree. And we're working with the ministry to actually implement those recommendations. So when it comes to policies and laws, I think it's also important to continue to identify, and this is not the only one, but this was one of the important ones, which has an impact on how women register their businesses, how they find opportunities to ease the procedures. And the third activity, which we thought would cut across a number of issues we've been talking about today, is the access to information, networking, and skills. So Vietnam already had something called a national SME portal, where they made available information that would be useful for the SMEs. But we also saw, and this time evidence said it very clearly, that women have additional issues. Women have additional needs. There's need to have more opportunities for networking, for mentoring, for mental health space, for easing procedures. So we established what we call a sub-portal for women entrepreneurs under the National SME Portal. So this not only looked at making available all information related to starting a business, managing a business, but also all the trainings available across the ministries and agencies, the different innovative financial tools which go beyond bank loans these days. But as a women entrepreneur, where would you find information on all of that? So putting together information on all innovative financing instruments available through private sector and public banks in Vietnam. And this sub-portal also is building in a mechanism where it gets feedback from women entrepreneurs on a regular basis. The user engagement, both in the design as well as in managing it, I think was extremely important to make sure this is not, again, something that's top down and it's useful for women entrepreneurs. So I won't go too deep into this, but I think from a service delivery point of view, based on these activities and a lot of others, I think some of the key takeaways, just to give in terms of headline, was that we realized that one size doesn't fit all. So depending on the country that we are operating in, I think we have some very useful gold standards from across the region, but it has to be designed based on what's going on at the country level and what's acceptable. Institutional coordination was really critical. Women entrepreneurs, Sarah mentioned this and other speakers mentioned this, women entrepreneurs being engaged in policy making, in implementation, and holding stakeholders accountable has been a useful process, not just in the women entrepreneur ecosystem, but I think overall in the governance system in the country. And also, COVID has shown us that everything that we do, we need to make sure that we're building back better. So the post-pandemic resilience, not only in the context of COVID, but also I think climate change, disasters, and in our region especially, it becomes even more important. But Sarah, sorry, I've taken a lot of time there, but also very enthusiastic given the topic. So just wanted to share a few key insights here. Thank you.
Thank you, Sudha. And I think I've looked at us in the panel, and I think we've all been sitting and nodding and agreeing with a lot of the things that you said. So thank you so much for sharing those great inputs, Sudha. Jeannie, I will let you come in here and share your
Thank you.
thoughts on this question right away.
Thank you. So it's great that we're talking about this during International Women's Month. I'll come from the perspective of a social entrepreneur on the ground, and we were purely about business. We started at Echo Store, and this was about bringing products that were green to market. And then we realized our whole supply chain had to be integrated, and these were all the micro producers who needed so much capacity building and the whole shebang of just being able to put their product on our shelves. So purely from business, okay? And what had happened is that people were confused. Were we teaching or were we selling? And we were saying, but we're selling. But no, wait a minute, we're teaching. And that's when government started to look at us, because we were the only one teaching the micro entrepreneurial women to go into market. All right, very clearly niche at that point. So I see the ILO's checklist. We've checked everything. And in the process of having innovated that whole direction of EcoStore, we had to divide as a service provider into a foundation. So we became both business women and we had become service providers. And as we kept doing what we needed to do for our business, government kept coming in and seeing how we were trying to work the issues amongst ourselves. And that's when they started to help with the programs, help us be able to support the micro women, and therefore grant funds started to go into the training capacity, and that's two different things. As a woman entrepreneur, you've got to sell. Over here in the foundation, we were teaching. And so we had to divide the work. So it was very clear. So at one period, I was really more service provider and my business partners were rolling out the business. Okay, so I was in between. And then an innovation of women gender issues and the need to be more inclusive came, and they brought us to the ground because the women programs were not working. Everybody was asking about markets, and everyone that was their teaching capacity building was about policy creation. How do we do all these checklists which had nothing to do with women and their markets? So we stepped in there. Basically, I took it on, and Great Women became the innovation platform. From an existing non-market directed program on policy directions for women in the local government, I shifted the whole program, and the team shifted the whole program, and we brought it into the market because we wanted to sell women products. Remember, we had stores. Now, the whole platform became an innovation. It was then picked up by different agencies, like the Canadian government had the funds there. The USAID brought us out to the ASEAN region. It became a whole system where multi-stakeholders came in to collaborate on the parts of which they were good at. And we were the holders for this. And at the end, it was all about how can we sell, right? Business women have to make money. And this is what we're seeing right now. Post-COVID, when Sarah and the ELO team comes to us and I said, I have to sell. Then they go, no, but can you do this? I said, you know what? We're never going to make money from grant money, right? Because as business women, we have like our P&Ls. We have to look at everything from a business perspective, which is so different from grant and service providers. It's just good that I understand both because we're working both. So Great Women took on the idea of, can we change your program? Because it's really not answering what women need. Women business owners like us, we are the first beneficiaries as business owners. And so the program, and thankfully for Sarah and the Philippine team, we're very open to say, okay, let's really do something that could be different. So I said, let's do something about flip your biz. Let's change the perspective. And we're rolling that out now. But everything there, I mean, we're even changing our support groups where we have JP Morgan coming in with fantastic technical information. But you know what? The real processing on the ground and in the teams are made by women entrepreneurs who have been bloodied, who have fallen, who have become broke, who can't get that loan, who cannot understand where they're going to get the next paycheck. And that's what's happening. So we're innovating again, now not in the micro level. We're innovating the small. So the difference now has shifted. And what have we seen? Which is the reason why I sit as private sector representative to gender in the Department of Trade and Industry. It was never there. That seat was never there. It happened because of Great Women that they put a spokesperson representative from private sector in the government grouping. Then they started to put in youth representatives, but gender was never there. So it was because of this innovation and the platform that we had created to see the different points of pain. That's really what it is. Points of pain from our side as women entrepreneurs, and where service providers where grant funds, corporate social responsibility funds, volunteerism programs can come in based on what the needs are and not what their program can give. That's the shift here. You cannot come in and help a woman entrepreneur if you didn't understand the nuances of the business side. And I think Sarah is seeing this with us as we go by our program, because we're creating our program every week. Like, we're analyzing how are we going to help them better, and it's exciting. It's exciting that we've become also a service provider. Maybe we're going to flip our own biz, right, as great women, but we're looking at each nuance of the women and the categories they're in. By this I mean a MSME micro woman would have a different need versus a small woman entrepreneur versus one about to enter the level of an A series, but then she might fall off because suddenly in any expansion, women drop off. And the brother, uncle, husband, or a business partner who's a male comes in. Now, it's a pattern, very clearly a pattern. How do we address this? Do we therefore help the men who are about to take the women up into an expansion mode, into that first A series of a business direction, so that more of us women in those businesses go to that level? What's happening is, you have maybe out of 10, maybe you'll have one who managed to get it out there into that expansion level. But it's interesting because even those in 5 years into the business right now, we're seeing that there are so much of the gaps, even with taxation issues, with government requirements that they can't even, they didn't even think about it. It's a thought process. So a lot of it is about innovative, creative process thinking. And we're sharing this because me and my business partners, we're so dynamic that we're always arguing, we're always thinking what's the next thing, we're innovating products, but that's our culture.
Yeah.
I think that's the culture we've brought into the spaces of the micro entrepreneurs in having integrated full supply chains nationally on food and textile for great women. We've done the full, literally from the ground to the international market and now online.
I
So
think you're
now
raising.
Yeah, so I can keep going on, but I think that's the key thing here is, number one, the stakeholder alignment must understand the different points and intersections, and you must have the women entrepreneurs in that game because you're servicing us. So we must be there to be able to speak, because at the end, we don't know where our next the next money is coming from if we can't sell.
Exactly. Yeah? I think you're raising great points, Jeannie. And I think particularly the fact that you need to be able to have a very nuanced perspective and understanding of what are the needs of women entrepreneurs when you as a service provider are supposed to serve them. So thank you so much for also bringing that. We're going to move to some questions from the audience before we wrap up. And I would like to start by asking a question from Christelle, who is asking, how can we encourage this commitment from top management to more gender inclusive financial service providers? And I think that this is something that was raised by Jen and Virginia in your comments earlier. So any one of you want to come in here and add further, or I'll open up for Jen to come in first.
Sure, thanks. Yes, I think there's room here for influence from lots of different types of stakeholders. Certainly, government and regulatory agencies, stock exchanges can have listing requirements. Government programs can, encourage or, go further than encourage and create targets and programs to create these incentives. Equity holders. So, if you want LPs to be more inclusive, convince their GPs to put pressure on them. If you want a business to be more inclusive, get the banks, the lenders, their funders to put pressure on them. So I think that, we're looking at kind of a layer beyond whoever we're influencing and making sure that those requirements are coming onto senior management, especially from who they need to listen to. We've seen kind of consumers make those types of demands, especially in the cocoa industry, for more accountability around child slavery and things like that. But those movements are difficult and rare. And I think what's becoming more common and more impactful is actually, the kind of combination of seeing the market opportunities in things like ESG and gender lens investing, and moving, funders in that direction so that then their portfolios move, and also governments kind of seeing this opportunity and also relaying those priorities.
Yeah, no, just to comment on that, and I think, Jen pointed out to several things. I think it's absolutely putting in the pressure, but also celebrating those that are the champions. No, and I think identifying and celebrating those champions it's always a good thing. I also feel that there's that important role of maybe it's a very kind of UN kind of term, but those community of practices. How do we make these kind of organizations come together and share really openly? I know from the ILO and our work in insurance that there's a community of practice that looks at how are we going to make sure that insurance products are more gender inclusive, and so kind of having those safe spaces as well of top management discussing these things. I think it's also a really nice element to complement, as Jen was saying, the pressure and the celebration of those who are doing a good job.
Thank you. Anyone else wants to come in here? Otherwise, I will address the next question to Katarina. Okay, then we have a question in the Q&A from Katrian, who is asking, what if making services gender responsive leads to higher costs for the services? Do you have examples of higher costs, and how is this addressed? And I think this comes back ultimately to your inputs earlier about commercial viability. And so would you want to share again just how this ultimately was something that you addressed and dealt with for Connecting Founders?
Yes, so as I mentioned earlier, so fundamentally, if you're a service provider, then what you have, you're limited, you're selling a service, so you're limited by time. There are only 24 hours in a day, right? So typically, if you want to be a commercial operator, it means that, if it takes more time, then you need to charge your clients more. But as I mentioned before, it is actually very difficult to do that in practice, because if you're working with small businesses, there is just that much that they can afford fundamentally, right? So that creates a very, very real challenge. As was mentioned by Jeannie, there are some service providers that can count on grants and the technical assistance. And so that helps, basically sort this issue. If you are a fully commercial operator, to be honest with you, you're going to have tough questions, to figure out, and you'll have to basically come up with a business model that makes sense for you. So as I said, some of the options are that perhaps you limit the percentage of women-owned businesses in your portfolio, so you kind of balance it out with others. That's just the reality on the ground. Or perhaps, instead of working with very early stage or very small businesses, which might be the more needy, but then the reality and the practicality is that you move towards, better established markets, because anyone that works in the region knows that it's not that there is no capital. There is plenty of capital around, but it's very limited. And there are a few entrepreneurs that get a lot of funding, and the majority gets no funding. So it's sometimes it's a little bit the pragmatism of that, which perhaps is not so encouraging this, but perhaps there are ways to get around that.
Thank you, Katarina. And I think it's what you're saying ultimately is, I think that as a private service provider, thinking about what is the clientele that ultimately is going to allow profitability while also serving women entrepreneurs, I think that is an important point. And then I think then in connection to that, also thinking about who are other stakeholders, who are other organizations in that ecosystem that can provide support to, if it's more micro, early stage. I think that's something to complement that perspective with potentially. We're very much running out of time. And so unfortunately, I have to thank all of you panelists and speakers for these great inputs. And we have one short announcement that we wanted to share before we close this webinar. The WED team and the Rebuilding Better project, we have been currently working on expanding the ILO's work on the WeCheck to Southeast Asia. And so what we have done in the past year is we have trained external consultants, including Katarina, who is in the panel today, to facilitate this process with external organizations. And so what we are doing now is we're looking for organizations who are motivated to take steps towards becoming more gender inclusive and that are interested in joining a WeCheck process in 2022. So we have, as of today, to celebrate also this particular day of the year, we've opened a call for applications for organizations who are interested to submit their application to participate in the WeCheck. The call will be open throughout this month. Final deadline to submit an application is 31st of March. And I think the link to access this call for application will be shared in the chat shortly so that you all can access this. If you have questions about this, feel free to also reach out to any of us in the ILO team and we will happily provide you with more information. Great, thank you so much on behalf of the ILO organizing team to our speakers today, Jen, Suda, Jeannie, and Katarina. We very much appreciate you joining us. Also, Virginia, you were part of the organizing team, but also an excellent speaker in providing input today. So thank you also to you. And thank you also to the participants for your active participation in the chat and in the Q&A. And I think this ultimately allowed us to have a very interesting, rich discussion, although a bit short, but we'll continue this some other time. So thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day. And again, happy International Women's Day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.